You might have seen the headline, or maybe you heard it secondhand from someone who works offshore, or caught it in one of those 10-second news segments they squeeze between the weather and sports. Communication lost with Gulf platform. Crew unresponsive for 72 hours. 3 days of silence from 87 people on a steel island 130 miles from the nearest coast. The Coast Guard mobilized. The company issued carefully worded statements. Social media did what social media does. What nobody reported, what I need to tell you now, is what actually happened inside those 3 days. I was there. I was one of the 87 people who stopped answering the phone. And I need you to understand something before I start. We didn't stop because we couldn't. We stopped because one man decided we would, and the rest of us let him, including me, especially me. My name is Owen Bryce. I was a roughneck on the Meridian IV, a deepwater production platform owned by Boss Energy, stationed about 130 miles south of Port Fortune, Louisiana. I'd been in oil and gas for 12 years by that point, working my way through enough rigs to lose track of the number. I ended up on the Meridian IV because Voss was offering 20% above market rate for a 28-day rotation, and I didn't bother asking why. In this industry, when someone pays above market, it means one of two things. The rig is in a miserable location, or it's in miserable shape, sometimes both. The Meridian IV was both. She was a 4th generation semi-submersible, which sounds impressive until you learn that 4th generation in offshore drilling is like saying a car is from the 90s, not vintage, just old. The kind of old that means corrosion creeping along pipe joints, gaskets that should have been replaced 2 maintenance cycles ago, safety systems held together by the collective experience of people who learned to work around the gaps. I'd seen worse rigs. I'd seen better ones too, and the better ones didn't need to pay 20% above market. The crew was the usual mix. Roughnecks like me, roustabouts, derrickmen, crane operators, welders, mechanics, cooks, medics, a handful of control room operators, and the management layer that floated above us like oil on water. 87 people on a platform designed for 110, which sounds spacious until you understand that every square foot of an offshore rig is allocated to machinery first, safety equipment second, and human comfort a distant third. Your bunk is a coffin with a curtain. Your workspace is a steel corridor that smells like diesel and sweat, and the particular tang of salt air mixed with hydraulic fluid. You eat in a mess hall that seats 40 at a time, shoulder to shoulder, trays sliding on tables that are bolted to the floor because the ocean doesn't care about your meal schedule. I'd been on the Meridian IV for 2 months when everything fell apart, long enough to know the crew, the rhythms, the shortcuts, long enough to be complicit. Let me say that clearly, because it matters. I knew the rig was cutting corners. Everyone knew. Boss Energy had been deferring maintenance for at least a year before I arrived, and the crew had adapted the way crews always adapt, with duct tape, institutional knowledge, and a mutual agreement not to write things down. There was a blowout preventer inspection that should have happened in March. It didn't happen. There were pressure tests on the wellhead assembly that got logged as complete when they'd been partially completed or not completed at all. I know, because I signed 3 of those logs myself. My signature, my employee number, my tacit agreement that the numbers looked fine when I hadn't verified half of them. I could tell you I did it because I was pressured, and that would be partially true. I could tell you I did it because everyone else was doing it, and that would be entirely true. But the honest reason is simpler than either of those. I did it because the pay was good, and I wanted to keep getting it. Every person on that rig had made the same calculation. We were all standing on the same rotten floor, and we all knew it. And we all kept walking because stopping meant looking down. Dennis Gaines was the platform manager, the man in charge of everything that happened on the Meridian IV. He was in his mid-50s, ex-Navy. Built like someone who'd been strong once and was now just large, Gaines was the type of leader who managed by presence rather than policy. He filled doorways, spoke in a baritone that didn't need volume to carry authority, and had a way of looking at you that communicated exactly how little your concerns interested him. He wasn't cruel. I want to be clear about that. Before everything happened, I would have called him competent, maybe even effective. He kept the rig running, kept the crew in line, kept production numbers where the company wanted them. The fact that he did this by cutting corners was, in his calculus, just resource management. Marcus Terrell was the chief mechanic, and in many ways he was Gaines' opposite. Quiet where Gaines was loud, precise where Gaines was broad. Terrell had been offshore for over 20 years and had the kind of authority that comes not from a title but from the fact that everyone on the rig had seen him fix something they thought was unfixable. He was the person you went to when the manual didn't have an answer. He was also the person most likely to tell you, calmly and without judgment, that what you were doing was going to get someone killed. He'd said it about the deferred BOP inspection. He'd said it about the pressure test logs. Nobody argued with him. Nobody changed anything either. My closest friend on the rig was Dale Harmon, a derrickman from Odessa who'd been offshore almost as long as I had. Dale was the kind of person who made the work bearable. Easy laugh, endless supply of bad jokes, the ability to make a 12-hour shift feel like 8. He was also, like me, a go-along-to-get-along type. Neither of us was built for confrontation. We'd both looked at the maintenance logs and shrugged. We'd both heard Terrell's warnings and nodded and gone back to work. In different circumstances, that might have just made us ordinary. On the Meridian IV, it made us accessories. The gas kick happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember the day because I'd just come off my lunch break and was walking the catwalk toward the drill floor when the deck shifted under my feet. Not a wave shift. I'd spent enough years at sea to know the difference between the ocean moving the rig and the rig moving on its own. This was the rig, a low gutting vibration that started in the steel and traveled up through my boots into my jaw. Then the alarm. You hear a lot of alarms on an oil rig. Most of them are procedural. Equipment's cycling through test sequences, pressure thresholds that get tripped and cleared 3 times a shift. You learn to filter them the way people in cities learn to filter sirens, but there's one alarm that nobody filters. It's the well control alarm, and it sounds different from everything else, a rapid, stuttering klaxon that exists at a frequency designed to bypass your ability to stay calm. When that alarm goes off, your body knows what your brain hasn't caught up to yet. Something is coming up the well that isn't supposed to. A gas kick is what happens when formation pressure exceeds the hydrostatic pressure of the drilling mud. Gas pushes into the wellbore and starts rising. If you catch it early, you close the blowout preventer and circulate heavy mud to push the gas back down. If you don't catch it early, the gas reaches the surface, expands, displaces the mud column, and then you have a blowout. Deepwater Horizon was a blowout. 11 people died and the Gulf bled oil for 87 days. Our kick was caught, barely. The blowout preventer activated and sealed the well, and for about 90 seconds the entire rig held its breath while the drilling crew monitored pressures and the rest of us stood exactly where we were, waiting to find out if we were about to die. We weren't. The pressures stabilized. The BOP held. Neil Jansen, the tool pusher, called it contained. People started breathing again. Someone on the drill floor threw up, and nobody made fun of him because half of us wanted to do the same thing. It was contained, we were alive, and in the raw relief of that moment before the adrenaline had finished draining from anyone's bloodstream, the calculations began. A gas kick on a deepwater rig triggers mandatory reporting. The Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement gets notified. An investigation follows. And every piece of documentation on the rig gets examined with a magnifying glass. Every deferred inspection, every incomplete pressure test, every signed log with fudge numbers, all of it would surface. Gaines knew it. Terrell knew it. Pete Saldana, the company representative on the rig, definitely knew it, because he was on the satellite phone to Voss headquarters within minutes of the all clear, talking in the low, urgent monotone of a man explaining a very expensive problem to people who did not want to hear about it. I don't know exactly what was said on that call. What I know is that Saldana found Gaines afterward, and the two of them were in Gaines' office for over an hour. When they came out, Gaines called a meeting of senior crew, department heads, shift supervisors, anyone with the word chief or lead in their title. I wasn't in that meeting. Harmon wasn't either, but Terrell was, and when he came out, I could see it on his face before he said a word. "They want to bury it," Terrell told me. We were in the corridor outside the machine shop. His voice was flat, not angry, which was somehow worse than anger. Saldana's position is that the kick was a routine, well-controlled event. Minor gas influx contained by standard procedure. No reporting threshold met. Was it? I asked, and I remember the way the question tasted. Weak, already compromised, I knew the answer. I'd felt the deck heave. I'd heard the alarm. There was nothing routine about what had happened. We almost lost the well, Owen. Terrell looked at me. The BOP sealed on the backup system. Primary actuation failed. If the backup hadn't caught it, we'd be having a very different conversation right now. Or we wouldn't be having one at all. He paused. And the BOP isn't going to hold a second time. Not without a full overhaul that Voss has been deferring for 14 months. I stood there and nodded. And I didn't say what I should have said, which was, then we need to report it. Instead, I asked what Gaines's plan was. Terrell told me. Gaines and Saldana intended to file an internal report, classifying the event as a minor gas influx, below the BC reporting threshold, while the crew continued normal operations. No external notification, no investigation, business as usual. Except that 87 people would now be working on a rig with a blowout preventer they knew had partially failed, on a well that had already kicked once. I told them it's criminal, Terrell said. Gaines told me to think about my retirement. That was 2 days before the silence started. The next 36 hours were the kind of tense that doesn't announce itself. On the surface, the rig functioned normally. Shifts ran, drills operated, meals appeared in the mess hall at the scheduled times, but underneath the routine, a fracture was spreading and everyone could feel it even if nobody wanted to name it. Terrell had allies. Lucia Reyes, the safety engineer who'd been quietly cataloging maintenance failures for months, a handful of the older mechanics who'd worked under Terrell long enough to trust his judgment more than Gaines's authority, Colin Yates, a 25-year-old crane operator who'd only been offshore for 2 years, and still had enough fresh perspective to be horrified by what was being proposed. They wanted to report. They were right. Gaines had everyone else. Not because everyone else agreed with him. I don't think most people thought about it in terms of agreement or disagreement. He had them because the alternative was terrifying in a different way than the compromised BOP. Reporting meant an investigation. An investigation meant the logs would be examined. The logs would reveal the deferred maintenance, the falsified inspections, the entire culture of shortcuts that every single person on that rig had participated in. We weren't just witnesses, we were co-conspirators. Every roughneck who'd signed a log, every supervisor who'd looked the other way, every one of us who'd cashed those above-market paychecks and not asked hard questions. We were all exposed. Gaines didn't need to threaten people. He just needed to let them sit with the math. I sat with the math. I did the calculations in my bunk at night, staring at the underside of the mattress above me, listening to the ocean work against the hull. If the kit got reported, the BOP failure would come out, the deferred maintenance would come out, the falsified logs, my signature would come out. At best, I'd lose my career in an industry I'd spent 12 years building a life in. At worst, I'd face criminal charges. Negligence, maybe manslaughter if someone had died, which they hadn't, but only by the grace of a backup system that had no obligation to function and could choose not to next time. I told myself I needed more time to think. That's what cowardice sounds like when it's wearing a reasonable face. On the morning of what became day 0, the day the silence started, Gaines called an all-hands meeting on the mess deck. This was unusual. Platform managers don't typically address the entire crew. They manage through the chain of command, passing directives down through tool pushers and shift supervisors. An all-hands meeting meant something had changed. Gaines stood at the front of the room, Saldana beside him, and told us that the rig's external communication systems had experienced a cascading technical failure. Satellite uplink radio, the backup radio, the emergency positioning system, all of it was down. He said the technical team was working on repairs. He estimated 72 hours to restore full capability. In the meantime, operations would continue as normal. I was standing near the back of the mess hall, shoulder to shoulder with Harmon. I remember the room being very quiet. Not the quiet of concern, the quiet of recognition. Every person in that room understood what was happening. 87 people, and not one of us believed in a cascading technical failure. because cascading technical failures don't take out every communication system simultaneously, including the emergency systems that are specifically designed to function independently of everything else. The systems weren't down. They'd been shut off. Gaines had made the decision for all of us. I looked around the room. I looked at faces I knew. Men and women I'd worked alongside for 2 months, shared meals with, complained about the weather with, trusted with my physical safety every day, in an environment where a moment's inattention could kill you. I watched those faces process what was happening and arrive one by one at the same place. I arrived at silence. Not agreement, not resistance, just silence. The path of least resistance, which was also the path of most complicity, which was also the path I'd been on since the day I signed my first falsified log. Terrell was not silent. He stood up and said, clearly, and without raising his voice, that the communication shutdown was deliberate, and that the crew was being prevented from reporting a well-controlled event that endangered every person on the platform. Gaines listened, nodded, as though acknowledging a valid but ultimately irrelevant point, and told Terrell that he was being relieved of duty, pending the resolution of the communications issue, for his own well-being. 2 of Gaines's shift supervisors escorted Terrell out. Riaz stood up to object and was escorted out with him. Yates started to stand, and Harmon, next to me, put a hand on the kid's shoulder and pushed him gently back into his seat. I did nothing. I stood at the back of the room and watched the only people with the courage to speak get walked out like disciplinary cases, and I did nothing. I want that to be clear. I want you to understand the kind of person who's telling you this story. After the meeting, the rig settled into a new configuration. It happened faster than you'd think. Within hours, Gaines had established what amounted to a soft lockdown. Terrell, Reyes, and 4 other crew members who'd vocally supported them were confined to the accommodations module. Not locked in, not exactly, but Gaines had posted people at the module exits who strongly suggested it was best if everyone stayed where they were until things got sorted out. The communications room was staffed around the clock by Gaines's people. The satellite phones that some crew members carried for personal use were collected, voluntarily, Gaines said, though the 2 men standing behind him while he said it gave the request a certain weight. What struck me wasn't the speed of it. It was how reasonable each individual step seemed when you looked at it in isolation. Confining Terrell. He was disrupting operations during a crisis, staffing the comms room, standard protocol during a system's failure, collecting personal phones, preventing unauthorized transmissions that might cause panic on shore. Each piece made sense if you squinted. It was only when you stepped back and saw the whole picture that it became what it was. Man seizing control of a small population because the alternative was accountability. Most of the crew went along with it. I went along with it. I want to stop saying that, but I can't, because it kept being true. The first day of silence passed in something that approximated normalcy. Shifts ran. Production continued. The drill floor operated. Meals were served. But the texture of everything had changed in ways that were hard to articulate and impossible to ignore. Conversations got shorter. People stopped gathering in common areas. The usual noise of the rig, the constant industrial symphony of machinery and wind and human activity, seemed to thin, as though the platform itself was holding something back. And then there was the sound from the well. I first noticed it that evening, standing on the lower deck near the moon pool, the opening in the hull where the drill string passes through to the ocean below. The moon pool was always loud, water slapping against steel, the drill string humming with torque, the hydraulic systems that managed the riser assembly cycling through their rhythms. But underneath all of that, there was something new, a low, sustained vibration that I didn't hear so much as feel in my molars, in my sternum, in the soles of my feet. It was like standing on a speaker, playing a note just below the threshold of audibility present, but unnameable there and not there. I asked Harmon about it that night. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "I thought that was just me. It wasn't just us." Over the next 2 days, nearly everyone on the rig mentioned the vibration in one way or another, though nobody could agree on what it was. The drill crew said it was a harmonic in the riser assembly. Normal, nothing to worry about. The mechanic said it was the well bore settling after the gas kick, pressure finding new equilibrium deep in the formation. Saldana said he didn't hear anything. The explanations were all plausible, and none of them accounted for the way the sound made you feel watched. I don't know how else to describe it. It was the sensation of being in a room you thought was empty, and realizing it wasn't. Day 2 is when things started getting bad. It started with small things. An argument in the mess hall that turned into a shoving match, 2 roustabouts who'd been friendly for weeks, suddenly unable to be in the same room. A mechanic who refused to go near the drill floor said the vibration was making him sick, and had to be physically walked to his post by a shift supervisor. People sleeping poorly or not at all. Short tempers, shorter patience, the kind of interpersonal friction that's normal on a rig after a few weeks got compressed into hours, as though someone had turned a dial. I noticed other things too. The water around the rig had changed. From the lower decks, you could see the ocean surface through gaps in the hull plating, and the water that was usually a deep, opaque Gulf green had taken on an iridescent quality, a sheen that caught the light and broke it into colors that didn't look like petroleum. Dead fish appeared, not in large numbers, but consistently, floating belly up in the current shadow of the platform. Small things, bait fish, mostly. But also, once something larger, an amberjack, maybe 4 feet long, drifting past the moon pool with its mouth locked open in a way that didn't look like any dead fish I'd ever seen. It looked arranged. Frank Dooley noticed the water too. Dooley was a lifer roughneck, early 60s. One of those guys who should have retired 5 years ago but kept coming back, because the rig was the only place that made sense to him. He'd been on the Meridian IV longer than anyone. After the gas kick, Dooley started drawing, not writing, drawing, spirals, on napkins, on maintenance logs, on the steel wall of his bunk with a grease pencil. Tight, precise spirals that started from a central point and wound outward in a pattern that looked almost mathematical. When I asked him about it, he said he'd seen the shape in the water. Coming up from below, he said, tracing the spiral on the table with his finger. Underneath us big. I told him it was stress. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't read and went back to drawing. The lifeboats were disabled on day 2. I found out because I went to check them. Not because I was planning to leave, just because some part of me wanted to know the option existed. The davits had been locked, the manual release mechanisms had been removed. Not damaged, removed. The parts were gone, taken somewhere I couldn't find. When I went to Gaines about it, and I want credit for this because it's the only moment in those 3 days where I did something that resembled courage, he told me it was a safety precaution. People get panicky during comm outages, he said. Last thing we need is someone launching a lifeboat in open water because they got scared. The comms aren't down because of a failure, I said. Gaines looked at me. Not angry, patient. The way you look at someone who's stated something obvious and unhelpful. Go back to work, Bryce. I went back to work. That evening, I found Harmon in the pump room. He'd dragged a sleeping bag in there and was lying on the grating between 2 hydraulic units, using his work jacket as a pillow. The pump room was loud. The constant chug of machinery made conversation difficult. But that, Harmon told me, was the point. The machinery drowned out the vibration from the well. Can't sleep in the bunks anymore, he said. That sound gets in your head. You lie there and you feel it in your chest and you start thinking things that don't make sense. What kind of things? He was quiet for a while. That it's fine. All of this, that Gaines is right and Terrell is making trouble, and the best thing to do is just keep working and not make waves. And I know that's wrong, Owen. I know it. But when I'm lying there with that hum in my teeth, it feels true. It feels obvious, like fighting is the crazy thing, and going along is the only sane move. I understood exactly what he meant, because I'd felt the same thing, lying in my bunk at night with the vibration conducting through the steel frame into my spine. Every rational objection to what was happening seemed to soften at the edges, not disappear, soften. The urgency drained out of them. The situation felt manageable, temporary, not worth disrupting. And I knew in the part of my brain that was still working properly that those weren't my thoughts. Or maybe they were. Maybe the vibration wasn't putting anything in my head that wasn't already there. Maybe it was just amplifying the cowardice I'd been running on for years. turning the volume up on the part of me that had always found it easier to go along than to stand up. That's the thing I still can't resolve, even now. I don't know where the sound ended and I began. Day 3 started with Colin Yates. Yates had managed to hide a satellite phone. I don't know how Gaines's people had been thorough in their collection, but Yates was young and scared and smarter than people gave him credit for, and somehow he'd kept one device back. In the early hours of day 3 before sunrise, he climbed into the crane cab, his workspace, the one place on the rig where he could be alone and above the sight lines of anyone on the main deck, and he tried to call the Coast Guard. He got through. I know this because the Coast Guard confirmed it later during the investigation. A 13-second call from a personal satellite phone, GPS coordinates matching the Meridian IV's position. A young male voice saying we need help before the call cut out. 13 seconds, not enough for a full distress call. Not enough to explain the situation, but enough to put a flag in a system somewhere. The call cut out because they found him. I don't know who spotted him. One of Gaines's shift supervisors maybe, or one of the crew members who'd quietly aligned themselves with the new order, because alignment was safer than independence. What I know is that 3 men went up to the crane cab, and what happened next was audible from the main deck, even over the wind and the machinery, shouting. A sound that might have been a body hitting steel. Then Yates being walked, half-carried, down the crane ladder and across the deck, toward the storage containers on the aft section. I was on the main deck. I was 30 feet away. I watched Yates, blood running from a cut above his eyebrow, his left arm twisted behind his back at an angle that made my stomach clench, being dragged by 2 men I'd eaten breakfast with that morning. I watched him try to plant his feet and get shoved forward. I watched him look around at me, at Harmon, at the 5 or 6 other crew members on deck, with an expression that wasn't anger or fear, but something worse. The specific, clarifying shock of a person realizing that no one is going to help them. They put him in a storage container. Steel, windowless, designed for equipment and supplies. They closed the door. It was a warm day. Gulf warm, the kind of warmth that turns a steel box into an oven in less than an hour. Someone, not Gaines, but one of his people, told the deck crew that Yates had suffered a psychological episode and was being isolated for his own safety. Medical would check on him. I stood there, my feet on the deck, my hands at my sides. The vibration from the well humming through the steel into my boots. I felt the wrongness of what had just happened with perfect clarity. The way you can feel the edge of a cliff through the soles of your shoes, and I stood there. I have thought about that moment more than any other moment in my life. Not the gas kick, and not the lockdown, not anything that came after that moment. Colin Yates looking at me from 30 feet away while blood ran into his eye, and me standing still. I have turned it over in my mind so many times that the memory has worn smooth, lost its texture, become almost abstract, a diagram of a man not moving. I keep looking for the version where I move. It doesn't exist. There was a version of me, I think, that might have moved. Before the rig, or maybe before the industry, or maybe before whatever series of small surrenders had brought me to a place where inaction felt like a viable response to watching a kid get thrown in a box. But that version had been shrinking for years, and the Meridian IV finished the job. I stood there because standing there was what I'd been practicing my whole career. Every log I signed, every shortcut I accepted, every time Terrell warned us and I nodded and went back to work. Standing still was my skill, my single perfected competency. The hours after Yates were the worst. Not because of any single event, but because of the quality of the silence. The rig had gone from tense to terrified, to something beyond both. A state of blank, functional compliance that didn't feel entirely human. People worked their shifts, they ate their meals, they didn't talk about Yates. They didn't talk about the comms, or the lifeboats, or Terrell in the accommodations module, or the sound from the well that was now so constant it had become architectural, part of the rig itself, as fundamental as the steel. I found Dooley on the lower deck that afternoon, sitting cross-legged near the moon pool, staring down at the water. His spirals were everywhere now. He'd been drawing them on the deck plates with a welding marker, dozens of them, each one slightly different in radius, but identical in form. When I approached him, he didn't look up. "It's not a sound," he said. It's a signal, Frank. I've been on this rig for 9 years. I've felt every harmonic this well can make. This isn't the well. This is something under the well. Something that was sleeping down there in the formation, and we kicked it awake. I looked down through the moon pool. The water was dark, lit only by the rig's subsurface lights. The iridescent sheen was there, that oily swirl of color that shouldn't have been there. And for a moment, just a moment, I thought, I saw what Dooley had been drawing. A shape in the water far below, turning slowly, a spiral, vast and geometric and deliberate. Not a current, not a reflection, not a trick of light on water. Something with form and intention, coiling in the deep like a signature. Then it was gone, or I blinked, or it was never there. I don't know. I'll never know. That's the part of the story that doesn't have a clean answer, and I've stopped trying to give it one. What I do know is what happened next, because the next part is about choices, and choices I can account for. Lucia Reyes found me on the upper deck that evening. I hadn't seen her since the first day. She'd been confined to the accommodations module with Terrell and the others. She looked exhausted in a way that went beyond sleep deprivation, the kind of tired that lives in the bones, but her eyes were focused, and what she told me was precise. The well pressure is climbing, she said. She had a small notebook. She'd been tracking readings from a gauge in the accommodations module that fed off the same monitoring system as the main control room. Slow but consistent 0.3 psi per hour for the last 41 hours. The formation is still pushing. The BOP is holding, I said. The BOP is holding at current pressure, but the casing integrity below the BOP was never verified after the kick. If there's a microanalysis, a gap in the cement, gas could be migrating outside the casing. Pressure builds in the annular space. The BOP seals the wellbore, but it doesn't seal the annulus. If the casing fails below the BOP, the preventer is irrelevant. I stared at her. How long? I don't know. Could be days, could be hours, could have already started, and we won't know until the gas reaches the surface through the seafloor, which would mean a blowout that no piece of equipment on this rig can stop. We were standing in the wind. The Gulf stretched around us in every direction, flat and dark under a sky that was losing its last light. The rig's lights were coming on, throwing harsh white circles on the deck. From where we stood, I could see the drill floor, the derrick rising above it like a skeletal finger, and beyond it, the flare boom where excess gas was burned off in a steady tongue of flame that had been flickering erratically for the last day. The sound, the vibration, pulsed through the deck beneath us like a heartbeat that belonged to something else. Gaines won't listen, Reyes said. Saldana won't listen. The crew won't act. I've been confined to quarters for 2 days because I tried to show people these numbers. There's no one left. She looked at me. I understood why she was asking me specifically, not because I was brave or principled or the right person for the job, but because I was the only person she could reach who hadn't yet committed so completely to the lockdown that they turned off the part of their brain that processed risk. I was on the fence. I'd been on the fence the entire time. And Reyes needed someone to fall, even if they fell gracelessly. The comms room, I said. The equipment isn't damaged. Gaines had it powered down, not destroyed. A hard restart takes 40 seconds. You know the shift rotations better than anyone you've been watching? She was right. I had been watching, not consciously, not with purpose, but with the particular attentiveness of a man who knows he might need an exit and can't stop cataloging them, even when he's telling himself he'll never use one. I knew that the comms room was manned by one of Gaines's people at all times, but the guard changed at shift transitions, and there was a window of about 5 minutes during the midnight changeover when the room was either empty or staffed by whoever arrived first, which was sometimes nobody for a few minutes because the route from the accommodations module to the comms room passed through the mess hall and people stopped for coffee. Tonight, I said, midnight changeover, I can get 3, maybe 4 minutes. I can give you more than that. There's a fire suppression panel in the galley that I can trigger manually. It won't start a real fire, but it'll set off the alarms in the accommodations module. Everyone in the vicinity will respond. It buys you time. We planned it in 10 minutes, standing in the wind. The plan was simple, which was good, because neither of us was in any condition for complexity. Reyes would trigger the suppression system at 11:55. I would be in position outside the comms room when the alarm pulled the guard away. I'd go in, restart the systems, and transmit a mayday on the emergency frequency. Clear, specific, undeniable, compromised blowout preventer. Crew held without communication. Request immediate evacuation. The hours between that conversation and midnight were the longest of my life. I worked my shift. I ate dinner in the mess hall, sitting across from a welder named Gibbs, who talked about his daughter's softball tournament for 20 minutes while I nodded and said the right things, and felt the vibration from the well pulsing in my jaw like a second heartbeat. I went to my bunk at 2200 and lay there in the dark, not sleeping, running through the plan, running through everything that could go wrong, running through the 30-foot distance between me and Colin Yates that I hadn't crossed, running through 12 years of signed logs and accepted shortcuts and quiet, efficient complicity. The vibration was strong that night, stronger than it had been. I could feel it in the frame of my bunk, in the bulkhead against my shoulder, in the fillings in my teeth, and it said what it always said, which was, stay, don't move. Going along is the sane choice. Fighting is the crazy thing. You've made it this far by being still. Be still a little longer. I listened to it. I felt the truth of it, because it was true in its way. Stillness had kept me safe my whole career. Compliance had kept me employed, kept me out of trouble, kept me in the comfortable middle, where nothing was demanded of me that I wasn't willing to give. The vibration wasn't lying. It was just agreeing with the part of me that had always been loudest. At 23:45, I got out of my bunk. The corridor outside the accommodations module was empty. The rig at night is a different animal, the same steel and machinery, but stripped of the human noise that gives it scale. Your footsteps echo. The lighting drops to emergency levels, red-shifted and sparse, turning familiar corridors into something that looks like the inside of a body. I moved quickly, staying close to the bulkheads, taking the route I'd memorized, not the direct route to the comms room, but the maintenance corridor that ran behind the galley. Less trafficked, less visible. At 23:53, I was in position, a supply closet 20 feet from the comms room door, cracked open enough to see the corridor. The guard, a roustabout named Fisher, who I'd worked alongside for weeks, was sitting in a chair outside the door reading something on a tablet, calm, bored, even. Just a man doing what he'd been told to do by a man he decided to listen to. At 23:55, the fire suppression alarm went off. Not the well control alarm, the general fire alarm, a different pitch, urgent but not existential. Fisher looked up. I could see him processing fire alarm, galley area. His responsibility? Not exactly, but close enough to pull at him. He stood. He looked at the comms room door, then down the corridor toward the source of the alarm. He walked toward the alarm. I moved. The comms room was small, a desk, 3 monitors, a radio console, the satellite uplink interface. Everything was dark, powered down but intact, exactly as Reyes had said. I found the main breaker on the wall behind the console and through it, systems hummed to life. Monitors flickered. The satellite uplink began its startup sequence, a progress bar that moved with the particular cruelty of technology that doesn't know you're in a hurry. 40 seconds. That's what Reyes had said. I counted in my head, watching the progress bar, listening to the corridor outside. The fire alarm was still going. I could hear people moving, footsteps, voices, the organized confusion of a crew, responding to an alarm that most of them probably suspected wasn't real but couldn't ignore. The uplink connected. I grabbed the radio handset and keyed to the emergency frequency. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is the Meridian IV position, 27.89 north, 90.13 west. We have a compromised blowout preventer, uncontrolled well pressure, crew of 87 held without external communication by platform management, requesting immediate evacuation. I transmitted it twice. The second time I added the well pressure data Reyes had given me, the BOP failure details, Gaines's name. I wanted it on record. I wanted it specific enough that no one could reclassify it as a technical issue. The response came back almost immediately. a Coast Guard operator acknowledging the mayday, confirming the position, requesting additional details. I started to respond and heard the comms room door open behind me. Gaines filled the doorway the way he always filled doorways. He was wearing his work coveralls, unbuttoned at the collar, and his expression was one I hadn't seen on him before. Not anger, not authority, but something raw and unmanaged. The face of a man watching the structure he'd built collapse in real time. He looked at the active monitors. He looked at the handset in my hand. He listened to the Coast Guard operator's voice coming through the speaker, tinny and professional and utterly final. "Bryce," he said, "put it down. It's done, Dennis. Nothing's done until they get here. You can tell them it was a false alarm system malfunction. I'll back you up, we can. The well pressure is climbing. The BOP casing was never verified. We're sitting on a second kick that the preventer can't stop." Something shifted in his face. For a moment, I thought I saw fear. Real fear, not the calculated risk management that had driven everything he'd done for the last 3 days, but the raw animal recognition that he might die on this rig. It lasted half a second, then it was gone, replaced by something harder. He came at me, not with skill or strategy, just the blunt physics of a large man who decided that the thing between him and survival was me. He grabbed for the handset I pulled back. He got a hand on my wrist and twisted, and pain shot up my forearm. The handset clattered to the desk. He shoved me into the console and the edge of it caught me across the lower back, and for a moment everything went white and airless. I hit him, not well. Not the way someone who knows how to fight hits someone. I hit him the way a desperate person hits an obstacle. Graceless, panicked, aimed at the general area of his face. My knuckles connected with his jaw, and the shock of it traveled up my arm, and Gaines staggered back a step. More surprised than hurt, I hit him again. This time, I felt his lips split under my fist. Blood on my knuckles, blood on his chin. He came back, harder, a fist into my ribs that bent me double, then a hand on the back of my neck shoving me down. I grabbed the edge of the desk and held on and swung blindly behind me and caught him somewhere. His ear maybe, or his temple. He let go. I straightened up and hit him again, and this time something in me was different. Not better, not braver, just different. The passivity that had defined every moment of my time on the Meridian IV, every moment of my career, every moment of my life that I'd spent choosing stillness over action, it cracked. And what came through the crack wasn't courage. It was something older and less noble, something that wanted to hurt the man in front of me. Not because he was wrong, but because hurting him felt like the opposite of standing still. I hit Dennis Gaines 4 more times before he went down. He landed heavily against the bulkhead and slid to the floor, his hands coming up to cover his face, blood between his fingers. I stood over him, breathing hard, and my knuckles split and throbbing. And I felt, this is the part I can't make peace with. I felt good. Not righteous, not justified good. The way your body feels good after exercise, after exertion, after the completion of a physical task. It was satisfaction. Clean animal satisfaction at having done violence to another person. The Coast Guard operator was still talking through the speaker, asking for confirmation, requesting status updates. I picked up the handset and confirmed the mayday. My voice was steady. My hands were not. They came in force. Coast Guard cutters and helicopters, arriving at first lights on what would have been day 4. The evacuation took most of the morning. 87 people transferred to vessels and aircraft in shifts. The rig emptied from the top down. Gaines was taken into custody on the first helicopter. Saldana went with him. Darrow was carried out on a stretcher. He'd been in worse shape than anyone knew, dehydrated and running a fever from what turned out to be an infection from a cracked rib that hadn't been treated. He'd gotten the rib during his initial removal from the meeting. He hadn't mentioned it to anyone. Yates was pulled from the storage container by 2 Coast Guard medics who had to cut the lock because nobody could find the key. He'd been in there for nearly 18 hours. He was conscious but barely responsive. His core temperature elevated to the point of organ stress. His skin blistered where it had contacted the steel walls. He spent 4 days in the hospital in New Orleans, I visited him once. He looked at me from his bed and didn't say anything, and I understood that his silence was a more accurate assessment of my character than anything I could offer in my own defense. Dooley was the last person off the rig. They found him on the lower deck, sitting by the moon pool, his spirals drawn on every surface within arm's reach. He was calm. He asked the Coast Guard team if they could feel the vibration, and when they said they couldn't, he nodded as though that confirmed something he'd suspected. He walked onto the helicopter under his own power and never worked offshore again. The investigation lasted 7 months. Voss Energy was fined, restructured, and eventually acquired by a larger company that promised to implement the maintenance protocols Voss had ignored. Gaines was convicted on multiple counts: reckless endangerment, false imprisonment, obstruction. He's serving 8 years. Saldana cooperated and received a reduced sentence. Terrell recovered and testified extensively. Reyes's notebook became a key piece of evidence. Yates sued the company and settled for an amount that was never disclosed. I testified too. I told the truth about everything, including my own role, the falsified logs, the silent complicity, the 3 days of inaction that preceded 3 minutes of action. The investigation board listened. They noted my cooperation. They noted the Mayday, and then they noted the medical evidence. Elevated levels of hydrogen sulfide and trace compounds in the blood work of every crew member, consistent with exposure to deep formation gas that had been seeping through the compromised wellbore since the kick. Cognitive impairment, emotional dysregulation, impaired judgment. The medical report described what the vibration did to us in clinical language that made it sound almost mundane. Toxic exposure, diminished capacity. It was true. The gas was real. The cognitive effects were documented. Every terrible decision made on that rig by Gaines, by the crew, by me, was made under the influence of a substance that literally degraded our ability to think clearly. I was cleared. No charges. The medical findings combined with my cooperation and the Mayday were enough. I walked out of the hearing a free man, and the narrative was clean. A flawed person in an impossible situation who ultimately did the right thing. Diminished capacity. Toxic exposure. Not your fault. I let that narrative stand. I let it stand because it was convenient. And because the alternative was admitting something I'm going to admit to you now. The gas didn't make me passive. I was passive before the gas. I was passive before the Meridian IV. I was passive before the oil industry. The hydrogen sulfide didn't create the man who stood 30 feet from Colin Yates and didn't move. It just made him more visible. And here's the part where the story should end with me learning something, with growth or change or the hard-won wisdom of a man who looked into the abyss and came back different. Here's where I should tell you that I left the industry, that I found a different path, that the Meridian IV was the crucible that burned away the coward and left something better behind. 6 weeks after the hearing, Maersk Offshore offered me a position on a platform in the North Sea. Different company, different continent, better safety record, good pay. I read the contract at my kitchen table, and I thought about Yates in the container, and Terrell on the stretcher, and Dooley's spirals, and the sound from the well that I sometimes still feel in my jaw when the house is quiet and the wind is right. I thought about Dennis Gaines coming through the comms room door, and the satisfaction, the clean, physical pleasure of hitting him until he stopped. I thought about 87 people on a steel island. Every one of them making the same calculation I made. Every one of them arriving at the same silence. I signed the contract. I'm on the rig now. New rig, new crew, new company. The safety protocols are better. The maintenance is current. The blowout preventer has been inspected and certified. Everything is exactly as it should be. And I'm doing good work. And I'm keeping my head down. And when someone shows me a log that doesn't quite add up, I nod and sign it, because the pay is good, and because standing still is the thing I do best. I keep telling myself the next time will be different, that the Meridian IV taught me something that when the moment comes, and in this industry the moment always comes, I'll move. I'll be the person who crosses those 30 feet. But I know the sound of my own voice when I'm lying, and it sounds exactly like this.